So this is the Xiaomi 13 and this is the Xiaomi 13 Pro. And I've been using both of these phones interchangeably as my main everyday devices for the past month, and they're both pretty compelling options. But with a roughly $300 price difference between the two, the question really becomes, what do you get in this Pro model that justifies that price jump? And so that's exactly what I aim to answer in this head-to-head comparison video. So let's dive in.
Okay, before we get to the differences between these two phones, let's start by talking about what's the same. So both phones have a bright 120Hz display with a max brightness of 1200 nits when high brightness mode is activated, and a peak brightness of 1900 nits for viewing HDR content. And then both phones have an IP68 dust and water resistance rating, and they're both made of premium glass and metal materials and feel super sturdy and well built. In terms of specs, both phones use the same Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 processor alongside the same octa-core CPU and Adreno 740 GPU. Both phones also have the exact same storage configurations, and they both also have Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 5.3 support alongside IR blasters, so you can use either of them as universal remotes. The software on both phones is also identical. They both ship with MIUI 14 on top of Android 13, but despite that Android 13 tag, almost everything with MIUI 14 feels pretty much identical compared to last year's MIUI 13, and that was also very similar to the previous year's MIUI 12. Now, MIUI has always been one of the smoothest Android skins in terms of home screen animations, like closing and opening apps and opening and swiping through the multitasking menu. These interactions all feel like straight butter. However, I will say, Xiaomi appears not to really be interested in adopting some of those more system-wide animations that Google started implementing with Android 12. And I gotta say, you really feel this particular lack of fluidity when comparing the experience to, say, a Pixel phone. That being said, if you love MIUI, then you'll no doubt have zero issues with either of these phones. However, for people with little to no experience with MIUI, let me just run through some of the quirks, and I'll try and keep this quick. So notifications still disappear from the lock screen after you unlock your phone, which is truly one of the most baffling decisions I've ever seen in an Android skin. You also have this pretty awfully designed media player, which looks nothing like the fun dynamic media player we have on phones running AOSP-based versions of Android 13. And you still have to manually disable this scan before installing option if you don't want to see this annoying full screen interface every time you install an app. You also still get this 10-second countdown screen anytime you want to enable accessibility access for third-party apps. We also still can't use third-party launchers and gestures at the same time, which is really frustrating. And you still have to change the battery saving settings on pretty much all of your important apps from this default recommended option to the no restrictions option if you're going to have any chance of receiving notifications from third-party apps in a timely manner, or in some cases at all. I will say, it seems as though Xiaomi did listen to one bit of feedback I mentioned in my review of the Xiaomi 12 last year, because thank goodness the fingerprint icon no longer disappears from the lock screen when your face is successfully registered. But aside from that, despite all of the quirks, I do still largely enjoy a lot about MIUI, and I in no way think of it as a deal breaker for either of these phones. But I will say, I think it's in serious need of a facelift for the next version if it's going to have any chance of keeping up with the competition. Okay, there's the software rant out of the way, and so back to comparing the two phones. And when you see all of the similarities between these two phones, geez, this regular Xiaomi 13 is seeming like a pretty fantastic option when you compare the price difference. So then let's chat about the difference between these two phones. And whilst, as mentioned, both are very well built and premium in terms of build quality, there are three key aspects of their designs that make the phones feel very different in the hand. For one, the size, and this one's easy. The 13 Pro is 6.73 inches compared to the more compact 6.36 inches of the regular 13. So if you prefer a smaller or larger device, well, there you go. The regular 13 also has a completely flat display, whereas the 13 Pro has a pretty drastically curved display. And by the way, the edge rejection on the bigger phone is not great at all, and I'm constantly finding myself inadvertently interacting with the screen via the sides of my hand. But then on top of that, I just generally prefer the look and feel of a flat display regardless, not to mention the fact that the regular 13 has tiny, evenly sized bezels all the way around, whereas the 13 Pro does not. And so for me at least, this is actually an area where I easily prefer the vanilla model. And then finally, the regular 13 also has completely flat sides and a less curved back panel, which I do prefer the look of visually, but in real world use, I have to admit, the curved back and slimmer sides of the 13 Pro make it significantly more comfortable to hold in the hand. Aside from that, both phones have glossy rear panels which pick up unearthly amounts of fingerprints. Both phones also have a similar looking camera unit on the back, though the 13 Pros sort of melts into the glass a bit more, and both phones have center hole punches at the top of their displays. And speaking of these displays, despite the fact that a lot of the display specs are very similar between the two models, there are two key differences worth mentioning. So on the 13 Pro, not only do we have a sharper WQHD Plus resolution panel, but it also has the more advanced LTPO technology in play, meaning it can drop all the way down to 1 Hz in the right scenario, which makes it quite a bit more efficient. And whilst we're on the topic of efficiency, let's chat about battery life. So on paper, the regular 13 has a battery capacity of 4,500 milliamp hours, whereas the 13 Pro has a bigger battery capacity of 4,820 milliamp hours. And that might not seem like a huge difference, particularly when you consider that the 13 Pro has a sharper display. However, in real world use, I noticed a pretty significant gap in terms of the battery life that I was getting out of the 13 Pro versus the regular 13. Now, to be clear, both phones are easily full day battery phones. However, where I was finishing most days under 20% on the regular 13, I was actually finishing most days with the 13 Pro on or around the 50% mark. And I never once had to charge the 13 Pro before the end of the day, whereas there were a couple of days using the regular 13 where it needed to be reduced at or around 8 PM. Now, on top of that, the 13 Pro does also support faster wired charging rated at 120 watts compared to the 67 watts of the regular 13, but both phones do support 50 watt wireless charging and even 10 watt reverse wireless charging. But if battery life is a huge priority for you and you want a phone that could easily last you well over a day of full use, then the 13 Pro is the way to go. Then we have the haptics. And if you've followed the channel for a while now, then you'll probably know how much value I place into a phone having good quality haptics. And well, put simply, the haptics on the 13 Pro are way more premium than the regular 13. Now, it's not like the haptics in the 13 are bad. Like, I'd compare them to the Nothing Phone 1's haptics if that's at all useful. However, as soon as you start using the amazingly premium haptics on the 13 Pro, that's when you notice how much nicer they are. And then in terms of speakers, you can definitely tell that the speakers on the 13 Pro are also of better quality, the sound coming out of them being slightly fuller and slightly richer compared to that of the vanilla model. Again, the speakers aren't bad in the regular 13, but they're definitely not quite as rich.
And so from there, we have the cameras. And on the surface, it would appear that both of these phones have very similar camera configurations. And well, that's because on the surface, they do.
So both phones have 50 megapixel main shooters, a 0.6x ultra wide, and a 3.2x telephoto shooter. Plus, they also both have 32 megapixel selfie shooters on the front.
And I've got to say, I'm hugely grateful that Xiaomi decided to include a proper telephoto lens this time around, unlike that funky 5 megapixel telephoto macro lens that we saw on last year's model, because it is a lens I always miss having whenever I use these cheaper versions. That being said, with the 13 Pro, that main shooter actually uses a much larger 1-inch sensor, which is fantastic for capturing more light in your shots, particularly useful for low light shots, and it also allows for more natural depth of field.
And then both the telephoto and ultra-wide lenses on the 13 Pro also use 50 megapixel sensors, whereas the regular 13 uses 10 megapixel and 12 megapixel sensors for the telephoto and ultra-wide lenses respectively. The telephoto on the 13 Pro also has OIS, which is super handy for capturing crisper, more steady zoomed in shots. And then on top of that, the Xiaomi 13 Pro can switch smoothly between all three cameras when shooting at 4K 30, whereas with the regular 13, whilst you can shoot at 4K 30 or 4K 60 with both the main and ultra-wide lenses, it can't switch between them after you've hit record, and it'll even just digitally zoom in if you try tapping that 3.2x button, and you can only shoot video with that telephoto lens when you drop your resolution to 1080p.
I will just add though, the actual image shooting process with both of these phones, it is honestly one of the best that you can get, at least in the Android world. Like, I've long complained about Android phones having far slower capture speeds compared to iPhones, but man, these phones are nearly as good as iPhones are in terms of actually capturing a photo whenever you tap that shutter button. And that is not an easy feat. And so hats off to Xiaomi for implementing what is perhaps one of the smoothest camera experiences that you can get on an Android phone. Now, aside from that, I would definitely say that the camera experience on the vanilla model is more than capable and holds its own against the Xiaomi 13 Pro in most conditions. And again, I love the fact that we have both ultra-wide and telephoto lens options this time around. But that said, if you are just wanting the absolute best camera experience between the two, well then the 13 Pro definitely takes the cake.
But there you have it. Those are the key differences between these two phones. And I've got to say, despite some parts of the regular 13 definitely being inferior to the 13 Pro, it is still a really compelling option. Like, as far as I'm concerned, the only really tangible difference between these two phones is the battery life. And even that isn't a deal breaker with the regular 13. I mean, I personally also appreciate the improved haptics as well as the camera experience, which is definitely better on the more expensive phone, but I also prefer the flat display as well as the more compact size of the regular 13, so it goes both ways for me. And I think there are definitely more than enough great parts about the regular 13 that make it a more convincing option over the 13 Pro, but if you want a truthfully honest answer as to which phone I've enjoyed using more, with pricing not being a part of the equation, well then I would have to say the 13 Pro. So feel free to use that information as you will, but regardless, I'm hoping this video has helped to provide some clarity in regards to which phone might be better suited to you. And of course, all of this might be completely irrelevant if either phone is not available in your region. Aside from that, if you enjoyed the video, then a sub to the channel would be greatly appreciated. But that's it. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will catch you later.